In 1925, a man sold the Eiffel Tower. Not metaphorically, not as a joke. He literally sold it, with a briefcase full of cash, an official government certificate, and a notary seal. The buyer walked away with a deed of ownership to 7,300 tons of French iron, having paid the equivalent of what today would be roughly $1.5 million. The buyer never went to the police. 2 weeks later, the seller repeated the exact same scam. Same forged letterhead, same hotel, a different victim. But that isn't even the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is that this man's blueprint is still studied today in training courses for intelligence officers and financial fraud investigators, not as a historical curiosity, as a working manual. Because what he did in Paris in 1925 is still working right now in corporate boardrooms, in banks, and in government contracting around the world. And by the time you reach the end of the story, you're going to realize one deeply uncomfortable truth. He didn't deceive people. They wanted to be deceived, and they still do. His name was Victor Lustig, and I'm going to walk you through exactly how the most perfect con in history works, step by step, just as it's deconstructed in closed-door academy seminars. Stay with me until the end, because there is one final question that investigators haven't been able to answer for a century.
Before we dive in, consider one number. According to Interpol, the global volume of sale of non-existent state asset fraud is estimated at $40 billion annually, and almost every single one of those schemes is a direct carbon copy of what Lustig invented in Paris 100 years ago. This isn't a story about the past. It's an instruction manual that is still operational, so listen closely. In the spring of 1925, 6 of the most powerful scrap metal tycoons in France received identical letters. The letterhead belonged to the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. The envelope bore the official state seal. The text was short, dry, and absolutely bureaucratic. It was written exactly the way people write when they don't need to convince anyone, because the weight of the government stands behind their words. The recipients were invited to a closed-door meeting at the Hôtel de Crillon regarding a matter that could not be made public until a final government decision was reached. All 6 men showed up.
None of them knew 3 things. First, the ministry hadn't sent any letters. Second, the man waiting to greet them in the most expensive suite of the most expensive hotel in Paris was not a government official. Third, within a matter of days, one of them would hand over a suitcase full of cash in exchange for the rights to an object that he never owned and never could own. The object was the Eiffel Tower. To make sense of this, you have to understand the context. This con was only possible because Paris was already primed for it. This wasn't the postcard Paris of painters and champagne. This was the real Paris of 1925, saddled with post-World War I budget deficits, an exhausted population, and infrastructure nobody wanted to pay to maintain. And in the center of that Paris stood the Eiffel Tower, a structure that, according to the original blueprints, wasn't even supposed to exist in 1925. It had been built as a temporary installation for the 1889 World's Fair, with a contract stipulating it be torn down after 20 years. The only thing that saved it was the advent of World War I. The antennas at the top proved useful for military communications.
But by 1925, rust was doing its job, methodically and relentlessly. Maintenance was costing the state a fortune, and newspapers were writing about it with open irritation. And here is the crucial detail you need to remember. In early 1925, several major Parisian newspapers published serious editorial pieces asking the exact same question. Wouldn't it be cheaper to dismantle this rusting eyesore and sell the 7,300 tons of prime iron for scrap? These weren't fringe tabloids, these were front-page editorials. Every businessman in Paris was reading them over his morning coffee, including one man who was reading them very, very closely. Stop for a second and think. If you opened the Wall Street Journal tomorrow and read that the government was seriously considering tearing down a national monument to balance the budget, would you believe it? You probably would.
because governments actually do things like that. And it is exactly on this probably wood that billion-dollar cons are built. Not on lies, on plausibility. His passport said his name was Victor Lustig. Well, one of the roughly 45 passports he carried throughout his life said so.
He was born in Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic. He spoke 5 languages without a trace of an accent. He played the violin, not as an amateur, but at a concert level. He knew dozens of French poems by heart, and he knew how to walk into a room in a way that made everyone present immediately want to impress him. And we need to pause here, because this wasn't charisma in the way we usually understand the word. It wasn't loudness, it wasn't pressure, it wasn't the charm of a used car salesman. Lustig was an exceptional listener. He had a way of staying silent that made the people around him talk more than they usually would. About money, about fears, about ambitions, about the things missing from their lives. And while they talked, he built his trap. His greatest weapon was never a lie. His greatest weapon was absolute silence at precisely the right moment. He folded the newspaper with the headline about the Eiffel Tower and slipped it into his pocket. The scheme Lustig began drafting that day relied on one fundamental observation about human psychology. Men who do business with the government stop being surprised by its decisions.
The state is selling off assets? Not strange. The state is demolishing something that costs too much to maintain. Basic economics. A red flag only goes up when a man starts discussing the deal with an outsider. Therefore, the deal had to be a secret. And pay attention, because this is the second stroke of genius. The secrecy couldn't look like an attempt to hide something nefarious. It had to look like standard operating procedure for state delicacy. Lustig rented a suite at the Hotel de Krillin. This was a critical structural element of the con, and it cost more than most people made in a month. Why? Because high-level government officials do not hold closed-door meetings in public cafes. They hold them in places that match their status. The hotel bill was a way to silently communicate to every man walking through the door. The man who invited you here does not need your money. The forged letterheads, printed at a discreet print shop on the orders of a gentleman with impeccable manners, stated that the Deputy Director General of the Ministry invited them for a confidential discussion regarding an upcoming tender. And here is the third stroke of genius. The word tender was chosen with surgical precision. Not sale, not deal, not offer. Tender.
A tender is a procedure. It's a government mechanism. It's something every one of those 6 men had navigated dozens of times in their careers. The word tender doesn't raise questions, it soothes the brain. Let me ask you a direct question. Be honest. How many times in the last year have you received an email from what looked like a government sender and clicked on it automatically because the logo and the font looked correct? 70% of modern phishing victims state during debriefings that the format of the email looked completely official. That is the exact same vulnerability Lustig exploited a century ago. The human brain trusts the visual aesthetic of authority far more than its actual content. That vulnerability is in you. It's in everyone listening to this. Nobody is immune. They arrived at the Krillon, 6 serious men in tailored suits. And they found a man who greeted them with the polite, weary restraint of a career bureaucrat. No excessive warmth, no backslapping or jokes. A brief handshake, a gesture toward the table, folders of documents already laid out, neatly, in order, just like at the ministry.
Lustig spoke quietly and strictly to the point. That's how men speak when they don't need to sell you anything. He explained the situation. The upkeep of the tower had become politically radioactive. Public debates about demolition were causing the administration unnecessary headaches. The decision had been made to handle the matter quietly and quickly by selling the structure for scrap metal. The tender was closed. The winner would secure exclusive demolition rights and all the iron. The state demanded absolute confidentiality until the final announcement, for obvious political reasons. 5 minutes of silence. Then the questions began. Business questions, technical questions, logistics, timelines, demolition permits. And here is the most important thing you need to notice. Not a single one of those 6 veteran industrialists asked the most important question. Nobody asked, wait, why wasn't any of this in the newspapers? Not one person.
Because in the world of massive government contracts, a lot of things never make it into the newspapers, and anyone who has ever contracted with the state knows that. Their own experience became the trap. While the 6 men asked their questions, Lustig was doing the real work. He was observing. Out of the 6, he was looking for one specific man. And notice, he wasn't looking for the richest, or the smartest, or the most experienced. He was looking for the hungriest, the one who had something to prove. André Poisson, a highly successful provincial businessman who had moved to Paris and made a fortune in metallurgy. He had the money. What he didn't have was the feeling that he had been accepted into the inner circle.
The Parisian business elite was a closed club with invisible rules, and Poisson felt that invisible wall every time he walked into a room filled with men whose grandfathers were already rich, while his own grandfather was still plowing dirt. He wanted a major project, not just big, iconic, the kind of deal that changes how your name sounds when it's spoken, the kind of deal where you get invited to the dinner parties instead of hosting them. Lustig spotted him in the first 20 minutes. He did it the same way an experienced predator spots a limp in a herd. Not by the clothes, not by the words, by the micro-expressions. The way Poisson looked at the other 5 men, the way he leaned forward just a fraction of an inch when the size of the contract was mentioned, the way he involuntarily adjusted his cufflinks when they discussed the prestige of the deal. After the meeting, Lustig asked Poisson to stay behind.
The conversation was long, unhurried, 2 hours. Lustig listened significantly more than he spoke. By the end of the evening, Poisson felt that the deputy minister had chosen him. Not because anyone had explicitly told him so, but because that's how it felt after 2 hours of attentive silence sitting across from him. They agreed to meet again. Here is a controversial truth for you. The greatest manipulators in history are not the best talkers. They are the best listeners. Think about it. The classic cinematic trope of a con man is a fast-talking, charming, loud extrovert. Reality is the exact opposite. A true professional stays quiet. The mark does the talking. And out of the mark's own words, the con man constructs the exact version of reality required to deceive him. If someone is listening to you a little too closely at a first meeting, it's not politeness, it's data collection. Remember that.
For a few days, Poisson analyzed the situation, and something was bothering him. Not the mechanics of the deal. It was a gut feeling. It was too secretive. Why him? His wife, a crucial detail that investigators would later focus on, started asking questions he couldn't answer. Why was there no public tender? Why meet in a hotel instead of the ministry? Why the rush? Poisson arrived at the next meeting carrying all these doubts. And right here, Lustig made a move that could have blown the entire scheme in a single second, but instead, it locked the trap shut forever. He went quiet. He looked away. And then, with visible effort, as if confessing something shameful and highly unpleasant, he mentioned that his salary as a government official, despite his high rank, was entirely disproportionate to the immense value of the decisions he was required to make. He didn't say it directly. He didn't ask. He didn't make a crude hint. He implied it, just enough so that Poisson had to find the actual words himself. And Poisson found them. The moment Poisson offered a discreet additional compensation to ensure the tender went to him, every last trace of doubt vanished from his mind.
The puzzle was complete. A corrupt bureaucrat, a backroom deal, an envelope of cash in exchange for a state contract. This was a reality Poisson understood perfectly. He knew how to navigate this world. And that is exactly what calmed him down. The mark's logic in that moment was ironclad. and completely false. If Lustig were a con artist, why would he ask for a bribe on a deal that was already fake? Therefore, the deal is real. The official is just greedy. That's normal. That's how the world works. Poisson came to that conclusion entirely on his own. Lustig didn't spoon-feed it to him. He didn't have to. Here is a shocking statistic. Modern behavioral psychologists studying fraud have coined a specific term for this move: parasite reassurance. It's when a scammer introduces a secondary, petty deception into the scheme, which reassures the victim about the primary, massive deception. According to the FBI, this exact technique is utilized in 73% of successful modern frauds involving government assets. 73%. And it was invented by a man sitting across from André Poisson at the Hôtel de Crillon in 1925. A suitcase full of francs changed hands in the suite. Poisson received a beautifully drafted government certificate, complete with official wax seals. The document looked absolutely authentic because the paper was real, the ink was real, the typography was real. The only thing that was fake was the reality the document supposedly confirmed. Lustig politely said his goodbyes, assuring Poisson that the official notification from the ministry would arrive via courier within a few days. He checked out of the hotel that same night. He was on a 2 a.m. train to Vienna. Poisson waited a few days. Then he drove to the Eiffel Tower, just to look, just to be sure.
He asked the guards. The guards looked at him in polite bewilderment. There was no notification from the ministry. There was no deputy director general by that name in the government registry. The suite at the Crillon had been paid for in cash by a man whose name matched no known identification. And now, the grand finale. Poisson did not go to the police. This wasn't weakness. It wasn't cowardice. It was the cold, hard calculus of a man who understood how the economy of reputation works. To admit that you were conned into buying the Eiffel Tower means that you will forever be known as exactly that man. In every boardroom, at every dinner party, behind every handshake, at every wedding, and at your own funeral. Oh, that's Poisson, the guy who bought the Eiffel Tower. Every other achievement, everything he had spent 20 years building in the metallurgy industry, all of it would be permanently erased by that one sentence. The loss of a few 100,000 francs was simply the price he paid to ensure that sentence was never spoken.
And this is the most terrifying part of the story. Poisson's silence was the greatest insurance policy Lustig could have ever asked for, and he knew it going in. The entire scheme was built from the ground up on the premise that the victim could never complain publicly. Not because he was threatened, but because his own ego would forbid it. Lustig didn't pick people who were easy to fool. He picked people who were too proud to admit they had been fooled. That is next-level psychological warfare. Let me ask you a direct question. Answer it honestly, just inside your own head. If you were scammed tomorrow out of your entire annual salary, and absolutely nobody else knew about it, would you go to the cops? According to a 2022 global study by PwC, 41% of victims of major fraud never report it to the authorities, or even to their immediate family. The primary reason isn't fear, it's shame. 100 years have passed. Human psychology hasn't shifted a single millimeter.
The conversation was long, unhurried, 2 hours. Lustig listened significantly more than he spoke. By the end of the evening, Poisson felt that the deputy minister had chosen him. Not because anyone had explicitly told him so, but because that's how it felt after 2 hours of attentive silence sitting across from him. They agreed to meet again. Here is a controversial truth for you. The greatest manipulators in history are not the best talkers. They are the best listeners. Think about it. The classic cinematic trope of a con man is a fast-talking, charming, loud extrovert. Reality is the exact opposite. A true professional stays quiet. The mark does the talking. And out of the mark's own words, the con man constructs the exact version of reality required to deceive him.
If someone is listening to you a little too closely at a first meeting, it's not politeness, it's data collection. Remember that. Theory 2. For him, the con was far more intoxicating than the cash. The money was just a byproduct. The real high was the feeling of outsmarting the system, and he wanted another hit of that high. Theory 3, the darkest one. He suffered from a pathology that modern psychiatrists would diagnose as an impulse control disorder combined with malignant narcissism. He simply couldn't stop, even when his own survival instincts told him to. The second buyer turned out to be far less restrained than Poisson. He didn't care about the reputational damage. He went to the police the exact same day he realized he'd been taken. Lustig managed to vanish just hours before detectives kicked in the door of his suite at the Creon. From that moment on, his face was plastered on French police bulletins, and soon after, Interpol's.
Here is a controversial truth. Every great con artist in history gets caught for the exact same reason, and it's rarely because of brilliant police work. They get caught because they cannot stop. Bernie Madoff could have retired a billionaire in 2003. He kept going. Charles Ponzi could have vanished after his first success. He doubled down. Anna Sorokin could have walked away with 50 grand. She went for hundreds. And Lustig was exactly the same. It's not a professional defect. It's a psychological constant. Once you build a scheme that works, your brain no longer perceives it as a danger to be avoided. It perceives it as a tool to be used again. And that is exactly what ends up killing every single one of them. And by the way, that rule doesn't just apply to criminals. It applies to anyone who gets exactly what they want in a way that feels a little too easy. Think about it. Lustig fled to America, and you need to understand one thing. The Eiffel Tower wasn't the peak of his career. It was just the warm-up. In the US, he continued to deploy the exact same toolkit: psychology, patience, and a laser-precise understanding of human vanity. But the scale grew exponentially larger and far more dangerous. First came the infamous Romanian box, a beautifully crafted mahogany box with brass dials and a couple of levers, which Lustig sold to wealthy Americans for $30,000. In the 1920s, that was the price of a mansion. The buyer would watch as Lustig fed a genuine $100 bill and a blank piece of paper into the machine. 12 hours later, the machine would spit out two identical, absolutely genuine $100 bills. It worked. The bills really were genuine. Lustig simply preloaded the box with real hundreds hidden in secret compartments. The buyer would take the box home, generate a couple more bills in the first 24 hours, and then the machine would stop working. Furious, the buyer would hunt down Lustig. But Lustig was already 3 states away. By the time the victims realized they'd bought a wooden box full of blank paper, a week had passed, and none of them went to the police, for the exact same reason Poisson stayed silent in Paris. Rumor has it that one of the victims of this scheme was Al Capone himself.
And this leads to a standalone story that perfectly illustrates how ice-cold Lustig truly was. He went to Capone. He asked the mob boss for a $50,000 investment, promising to double the money in 2 months. Capone handed over the cash, maybe out of curiosity, or maybe because even Al Capone was susceptible to Lustig's immaculate manners. 2 months later, Lustig returned, and he handed the money back, all $50,000 untouched. He told Capone that the venture had failed, but that he considered it a matter of honor to return a gentleman's principal in full. Capone was so utterly stunned by this display of integrity that he handed Lustig a $5,000 reward for being an honest man. That $5,000 was the goal of the operation from day one. Lustig never intended to double the $50,000. He simply calculated that a man with Capone's ego would consider it a point of pride to reward an honest man.
He conned Al Capone out of $5,000, and Al Capone thanked him for it. Then Lustig moved up to the big leagues, full-scale counterfeiting. He orchestrated the production of $100 bills of such terrifyingly high quality that the US Secret Service hunted the source for almost 5 years. In forensic textbooks, they are still referred to as Lansing notes.
named after the master engraver Lustig recruited. They were so good that bank tellers couldn't distinguish them from the real thing without specialized equipment. In 1935, they finally caught him. Not for the Eiffel Tower, not for the money box, not for Capone, for the fake dollars. One last shocking fact before we end. After his arrest, Lustig was held at the federal detention headquarters in Manhattan. He escaped. In September 1935, he tied bedsheets into a rope and rappelled out of the window in broad daylight. Dozens of pedestrians watched him do it. On his way down, he waved at the crowd, shouting that he was a window washer. The pedestrians waved back. He had 28 days of freedom before the feds finally ran him to ground in Pittsburgh. He remains the only inmate in history to escape that facility in broad daylight with a smile on his face. Let's bring it back to the end. He died in 1947 in the medical ward of the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, having spent 12 years in Alcatraz, America's most brutal penitentiary. He died of pneumonia, alone. On his death certificate, under the space for occupation, a prison clerk typed a single word: salesman. Technically accurate. He left behind a few passports, an old violin he had carried across continents, through 45 aliases and dozens of jails, and a handwritten piece of paper found among his effects during his first arrest. It was a list of 10 commandments for con men, written in his own hand. That piece of paper now resides in the FBI archives. Among those commandments are 3 that everyone should memorize, even if you never plan to scam a single soul in your life. Commandment 1, be a patient listener. Commandment 2, never look bored. Commandment 3, wait for the other person to bring up money. Never ask first. Read those 3 rules again. Those aren't the instructions of a petty thief. Those are the foundational principles of sales, high-level negotiations, and persuasive communication in the modern corporate world. They teach this in business schools. They use it in politics. Every successful account manager utilizes these exact rules. Victor Lustig articulated them in a jail cell 90 years ago, and they still work. Poisson's money was never recovered. Andre Poisson never gave a single public comment about the incident for the rest of his life. He died in the early 1940s. His obituaries remembered him as a respected industrialist, not a single mention of the tower. His family took his secret to the grave. The Eiffel Tower is still standing. It gets repainted every 7 years. It's incredibly expensive. Every now and then, the press publishes articles grumbling about the maintenance costs.